She only had $5 for a blind date, but what happened next would change her life forever. And the man watching her from across the cafe, he wasn't just any stranger. He was a single dad, a CEO, and about to make a choice that would shock her. "You won't believe what happens." Emma gripped her worn leather purse tightly as she stepped onto the crowded city sidewalk, her heart pounding in a rhythm that felt almost too fast to match her steps. The autumn wind tugged at her scarf, pulling it just slightly off her shoulders, and she adjusted it nervously. Her best friend had insisted on setting her up on a blind date, claiming that it was time Emma gave love a chance. But the thought of meeting a stranger and trying to make a good impression with only $5 in her wallet made her stomach twist into knots. She had counted it carefully that morning, making sure she hadn't overlooked a stray coin or forgotten a dollar tucked somewhere. That $5 would have to cover lunch, and maybe a bus ride home if things went terribly wrong. The small cafe she approached looked warm and inviting, with golden light spilling from the windows and the soft hum of conversation drifting outside into the chilly afternoon. The smell of freshly baked bread and brewed coffee hit her as soon as she opened the door, making her stomach growl with a mix of hunger and anxiety. She scanned the room quickly, noting that it wasn't particularly busy. Only a handful of people dotted the tables, sipping drinks or typing away on laptops. A table near the window caught her eye. It was empty, tucked slightly to the side, giving her a sense of privacy she desperately needed. Emma slid into the chair, her fingers brushing against the wooden surface, polished smooth from years of use. She tried to calm her breathing and smooth the wrinkles in her coat. Her eyes flicked nervously to the menu. Her options were terrifyingly expensive. Sandwiches that looked simple enough were priced higher than she could comfortably spend. Her heart sank slightly as she realized she would have to stick with the absolute cheapest option. A plain sandwich and a cup of water, that was all she could afford. As she placed her order with a polite, almost trembling smile, she felt a small spark of self-consciousness. She knew she had to look composed, confident, but the truth was she felt neither. Across the cafe, a man sat alone at a small table near the counter. He was tall, wearing a crisp suit that suggested power and careful attention to detail, and his hair was neatly combed. Daniel sipped slowly from a cup of espresso as he scrolled through his tablet, checking emails with a professional precision that seemed almost intimidating. But then his gaze wandered, as if drawn by something intangible. Emma. He watched her without obvious intention at first, simply noticing the small, anxious movements she made. How she smoothed her scarf repeatedly, how she nervously tapped her fingers against the table, and how she glanced at the menu as if hoping it might magically shrink to something more affordable. Something about her seemed fragile, but not in a weak way. There was a quiet determination hidden beneath her nervousness. Daniel felt a curious pull, a sense that her story mattered more than whatever urgent emails he had been reviewing. Emma, completely unaware of the observer in the corner of the room, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She tried to focus on her date's arrival, but every passing minute made her stomach twist with nervous anticipation. What if he didn't like her? What if he expected her to order something expensive? What if her $5 wasn't enough to make it through lunch without embarrassment? Her mind raced with every imaginable scenario, each one worse than the last. As she finally picked up the sandwich and took a small, cautious bite, she didn't notice a piece falling onto the floor. She flushed bright red, frantically trying to adjust her napkin to cover it, hoping no one had noticed. But Daniel had noticed. He didn't move or comment. He simply watched, with an intensity that made him seem almost protective, as if he were witnessing a small but significant moment unfold. There was something about Emma that intrigued him. Perhaps it was the honesty in her nervous actions, the lack of pretense, or maybe it was the quiet vulnerability she carried without shame. Just as she was trying to regain her composure, the cafe door swung open, letting in a gust of wind, and her date appeared. He looked around briefly before spotting her, and she felt a flicker of relief. But the relief didn't last long. He was distracted, checking his phone as he approached, barely acknowledging her existence. The smile he gave was polite but distant, and it did nothing to ease the tension that had built inside her. Emma forced a smile back, trying to make conversation, asking light questions, but his responses were short, distracted, and impatient. She felt the heat rising to her cheeks, the awkwardness pressing down on her like a weight. From across the room, Daniel continued to watch. He noticed how Emma's eyes flickered nervously toward her date, how her hands clenched slightly around her fork, and how she forced herself to take small, deliberate bites of her sandwich. He saw her anxiety, her careful attempt to remain composed despite the situation, and something inside him shifted. He reached for his wallet, pulled out a $20 bill, and quietly left it on the table, slipping a small note beneath it. He didn't make a scene, he simply placed it down, a silent gesture of kindness, a quiet acknowledgement that someone had noticed. The note itself was simple. "You don't have to worry about money. Enjoy your lunch. Someone who notices." Emma returned from the restroom a few minutes later, her nerves still frayed, and found the note. Her eyes widened in disbelief. She stared at the handwriting, her fingers trembling slightly as she unfolded the paper. She felt a rush of emotions. Gratitude, surprise, a strange warmth that made her heart flutter. For a brief moment, the tension melted, and she felt seen in a way she hadn't expected. She glanced across the cafe, trying to spot the person who had left the note, but the table near the counter was empty. Her date returned just then, leaning back in his chair, oblivious to the note and the small shift in her mood. Emma felt a strange mix of relief and embarrassment. The note had lifted a weight off her shoulders, but it had also drawn attention to her precarious financial situation in a way she hadn't anticipated. And yet the kindness from a stranger, quiet and unnoticed, made her feel oddly hopeful. Daniel, from across the room, had returned to his tablet, pretending to be absorbed in work, but he couldn't stop glancing toward her. There was something about her that lingered in his thoughts, a subtle pull that he didn't fully understand. He had only intended to offer a small gesture, a moment of support for someone who needed it, but already he felt invested in her story. Emma took a deep breath, adjusted her scarf again, and forced herself to focus on the rest of the meal. She tried to engage her date, but her mind kept drifting back to the note, to the mystery stranger who had seen her struggle and quietly stepped in. In that moment, Emma realized that even in a city full of strangers, even when life felt difficult and unfair, there could be kindness, unexpected, silent, and transformative. And somewhere across the room, Daniel continued to watch, sensing that this small, ordinary moment, the $5 lunch, the dropped sandwich, the quiet act of generosity, was the beginning of a story neither of them could yet imagine. Emma's date arrived late, much later than she had expected. The cafe door swung open with a gust of wind, and she immediately noticed him fumbling with his phone as he walked in, his eyes scanning the room without really seeing it. He was tall, dressed casually, but with a look of hurried professionalism, as though he had stepped straight from a meeting he couldn't escape. He glanced briefly in her direction and offered a polite smile, but it lacked warmth. Emma forced a small smile in return, her stomach twisting in anxiety. She had been trying all day to imagine what this first meeting would be like, but nothing could have prepared her for the awkwardness that hit immediately. He slid into the chair across from her, without any kind of greeting or comment on how long she had waited. The waitress came by to take their order, and Emma felt her heart leap in panic as she looked at the menu again. The items were still far beyond what she could afford, and now, with her date sitting in front of her, she felt pressure to choose something respectable, something that wouldn't make him think she was cheap or incapable. She gripped the menu tightly, feeling it crinkle under her fingers, and finally pointed to the least expensive sandwich with a polite, hesitant smile. "I'll have this," she said quietly. Her date barely looked at the menu. "Yeah, same," he muttered, tapping his fingers on the table as he checked something on his phone. He didn't make eye contact. He didn't ask how her day had been. He didn't seem to care that she had been nervous, waiting in the cafe, hoping to make a good impression. Emma swallowed hard, trying to ignore the lump in her throat. She felt small, almost invisible, in the presence of someone who seemed too distracted to notice her at all. As they waited for their food, the silence stretched long and heavy. Emma fiddled with her scarf, twisting the ends nervously, while her date scrolled endlessly on his phone. She tried to break the tension with light conversation, asking about his work, joking about the menu prices, but his responses were short, uninterested, and distant. Each answer made her heart sink further, and she could feel the weight of embarrassment pressing down on her. She wanted to disappear, to vanish into the cafe walls, to escape the awkwardness that seemed impossible to fix. From across the room, Daniel watched quietly. He had returned to his table after leaving the mysterious note, pretending to focus on his tablet, but his eyes kept straying to Emma. He noticed everything: the way she twisted her fingers nervously, the way her shoulders tensed, the faint blush that crept across her cheeks. He observed the way her date barely looked at her, how he fidgeted with his phone, as if their conversation were a nuisance rather than an opportunity to connect. Daniel felt a pang of protective instinct, an urge to intervene in some way. But he knew he couldn't just walk over and disrupt the moment. All he could do was watch and wait. When their food finally arrived, Emma felt a small relief. At least she could focus on eating, on something tangible, instead of the constant, uncomfortable silence. She carefully unwrapped her sandwich, taking small, deliberate bites so as not to appear rude or hurried. Her date, on the other hand, barely touched his food, scrolling through his phone between occasional sips of water. Emma felt a sharp pang of disappointment. She had hoped for a connection, even a small spark of conversation, but it seemed impossible to find with him. As Emma ate, she accidentally dropped a small piece of her sandwich on the table. She gasped quietly, pressing her napkin over it in a futile attempt to hide her clumsiness. She felt her face flush with embarrassment, imagining that everyone in the cafe was noticing her mistake. Daniel, observing from across the room, leaned slightly forward, his eyes softening as he watched her. There was no judgment in his gaze, only understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of her struggle. He could see the anxiety in her every movement, and he knew that the small act of dropping a piece of sandwich was not a failure, but a reflection of her genuine, unpolished humanity. Emma excused herself to the restroom, her hands shaking slightly as she pushed open the door. She needed a moment to gather herself, to calm the racing thoughts that threatened to overwhelm her. As she washed her hands, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the mirror and barely recognized herself. The worried girl, staring back at her, had been tense with anticipation, fearful of judgment, and exhausted by the effort to appear composed. She took a deep breath, smoothing her scarf and trying to center herself. For the first time in the afternoon, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, things could turn around. When she returned to the table, she noticed something new. There was a small envelope tucked beneath her plate, almost hidden. She blinked, confused, and gently picked it up. Inside was a note, written in neat, careful handwriting. "You don't have to worry about money. Enjoy your lunch. Someone who notices." Emma's hands trembled slightly as she read the words. Her eyes widened, and a mix of emotions surged through her. Surprise, relief, gratitude, and something she couldn't quite name. Her heart, which had been heavy with embarrassment and disappointment, suddenly felt lighter. She glanced around the cafe, searching for the person who had left the note, but all she saw were strangers, absorbed in their own worlds. She tucked the note into her purse and returned her attention to her date, who was still absorbed in his phone. The shift in her mood was subtle but profound. For the first time that afternoon, she felt seen, not by her date, but by someone who had noticed her struggle and quietly acted to help. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the validation, the acknowledgement that she mattered, even in a moment that had felt overwhelmingly difficult. She realized that small acts of kindness could have an enormous impact, that a stranger's gesture could change the course of her day, maybe even her perspective on life. Her date finally looked up from his phone and noticed her staring at the envelope. He raised an eyebrow, a small frown crossing his face. "What's that?" he asked, curiosity mixed with a hint of irritation. Emma felt a pang of awkwardness, unsure how to respond. She hesitated for a moment, then decided to simply smile. "It's nothing," she said softly. "Just someone being kind." The rest of the meal continued in awkward silence. Emma tried to engage in conversation, but her date's attention remained fragmented, divided between the conversation and the glowing screen of his phone. She felt a quiet frustration, but also a sense of calm she hadn't expected. The note had shifted something inside her, a subtle confidence that allowed her to sit straighter, speak more clearly, and stop worrying quite so much about how she appeared. From his corner of the café, Daniel continued to observe. He watched Emma regain a small measure of composure, noticed the way her shoulders relaxed slightly, and felt an unusual sense of connection. He had no way of knowing whether she would ever notice him directly, but for now, the act of leaving the note had created a bond between them, a silent understanding, a shared moment that was theirs alone. He knew he had made a difference, even in a small way, and that was enough for the time being. Emma finished her sandwich slowly, savoring the simple taste with a newfound appreciation. The tension that had gripped her at the beginning of the date had eased, replaced by a subtle sense of hope. She realized that while her date might not be the person to notice her fully, there were others in the world, strangers perhaps, who could see her struggles, her humanity, and her courage. And maybe, she thought quietly, that was the most important thing of all. As they prepared to leave, Emma tucked the note safely into her purse and cast one last glance across the café. Daniel was already back at his table, pretending to work, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching over her, quietly supporting her in a moment that had felt almost unbearable. She stepped out into the chilly afternoon, her heart a little lighter, her steps a little steadier, and her mind filled with possibilities she had never considered before. After that afternoon in the café, Emma couldn't stop thinking about the mysterious note. The simple words, written on a small piece of paper, had stayed with her like an echo in her mind. She replayed the moment over and over, the quiet gesture, the way it made her feel seen, and the subtle warmth it had left behind. Who could have done it? Was it someone from the café? A kind stranger passing by? Or maybe someone who had been watching her more closely than she realized? The thought both thrilled and unsettled her. Days passed and Emma returned to her routine, working long hours at the café to make ends meet. She served customers with a practiced smile, cleaned tables, and stocked shelves, all the while keeping the memory of the note tucked safely in her purse. Yet every time the café door opened and someone new stepped inside, her heart would skip a beat. Could it be him? The man who had noticed her struggle and quietly stepped in. She tried to convince herself it was just a fleeting fantasy, but deep down she hoped it wasn't. Meanwhile, Daniel had been thinking about her too. He couldn't explain the pull he felt toward her, the way her small acts of nervousness had somehow left a lasting impression. He had watched her closely, not in a voyeuristic way, but with genuine curiosity, trying to understand her world, her struggles, and her resilience. He had seen something rare in her, honesty, vulnerability, and a quiet strength that didn't demand attention, but commanded it anyway. Fate, it seemed, had a way of intervening. One crisp morning, Emma arrived at the café just as the doors opened, her hands full with groceries she had bought for a friend. She struggled to carry the bag to the counter without dropping anything. Just then, Daniel walked in. This time, it wasn't by chance. He had made a deliberate decision to come back to the café, to see her again. He spotted her immediately, balancing the bag with nervous determination, and a small smile tugged at his lips. Emma noticed him too, though only for a brief second. She mistook him for another customer at first, someone who might offer a polite smile and then move on. But there was something different about him this time. He approached with a gentle confidence, his presence commanding but not overwhelming. "Hi," he said, his voice calm and warm. "I'm Daniel." Emma blinked, unsure how to respond. Her mouth opened, closed, and then opened again. Finally, she managed, I remember you." Daniel nodded, as if recalling a memory that was equally vivid for him. "I saw you the other day," he said. "I thought maybe you could use a little help." His eyes were steady, kind, and unassuming, the kind of look that made you want to trust him immediately. Her heart skipped a beat. She could barely believe it. The man who had left the note, the one who had seen her struggle and quietly made a difference, was standing right in front of her. She felt a mixture of gratitude, surprise, and an odd fluttering in her stomach. She tried to steady herself, taking a deep breath. "Thank you," she whispered, almost more to herself than to him. They found a small table near the corner, away from the bustling crowd. As they sat down, Emma noticed the small details, the way Daniel's hands rested gently on the table, the slight crease in his forehead as he listened, the calm way he made eye contact without ever seeming intrusive. Conversation began tentatively, at first focusing on the café, the city, and the little things that seemed safe to discuss. Emma found herself opening up gradually, telling him about her life, her struggles, and the dreams she held quietly in her heart. Daniel listened, genuinely interested. He asked questions, not out of politeness, but out of curiosity, wanting to understand her world. He shared pieces of his own life too, being a single dad, the challenges of running a company, the loneliness that sometimes crept in despite his success. For the first time in weeks, Emma felt like someone was truly seeing her, not just her appearance, not just her anxious movements, but the person she was inside as their conversation flowed. A sense of ease settled between them. Emma laughed more freely than she had in months, and Daniel's smiles were genuine, unguarded. They discovered small connections, shared favorite books, similar childhood memories, a mutual love of quiet cafes and warm drinks. It was as if the universe had conspired to bring them together. Two people from completely different worlds, finding a common ground in the unlikeliest of places. And yet, there were small moments of tension that neither could ignore. Daniel's life was complicated. His responsibilities as a CEO and a father often left him exhausted, and Emma's financial struggles weighed heavily on her. She couldn't help but feel a sense of inadequacy, wondering if someone like Daniel could ever truly understand or accept her. At the same time, Daniel found himself cautious. He didn't want to overwhelm her with his wealth or his position. He wanted her to see him as a person first, not as a powerful figure who could solve all her problems. Days turned into weeks, and their meetings at the cafe became more frequent. Each encounter deepened the connection between them. Emma began to trust him in ways she hadn't trusted anyone in a long time. She shared small vulnerabilities, her worries about money, her fear of being overlooked, her hope that life could change for the better. Daniel, in turn, revealed the pressures of his world, the delicate balance of being a father and a leader, and the quiet loneliness that came with responsibility. It wasn't just conversation that built their bond. It was the small gestures, the unspoken understanding that grew between them. Daniel would notice when Emma looked tired and quietly offer a cup of tea. Emma would remember little details about Daniel's daughter, Lily, and share them when they met, showing that she cared. There was a rhythm to their interactions, a subtle dance of attention and consideration, of respect and curiosity, that neither had experienced before. Then came the day Emma discovered something that shook her completely. She had been chatting with a co-worker at the cafe when she overheard a conversation about a new development plan. The words cut through her like ice. Daniel's company was planning to buy out the cafe, turning it into a high-end chain. Emma froze, her hands gripping the counter as panic surged through her. This cafe wasn't just a place she worked. It was her safe space, a small sanctuary where she felt seen and valued. The thought that it could be taken away, replaced by something unfamiliar and cold, filled her with dread. Her mind raced. She thought of the customers, the co-workers, and the warmth that filled the cafe every day. How could someone who had been so kind, so attentive, be connected to something that threatened everything she loved? She felt a storm of emotions, betrayal, confusion, and a desperate need to understand. She couldn't confront Daniel without knowing the whole story, but the tension in her chest was unbearable. Later, when they met at the cafe as usual, Emma's hands trembled slightly as she set down her drink. Daniel noticed immediately, his brow furrowing in concern. "Emma," he asked softly, leaning slightly forward. "What's wrong?" She hesitated, then took a deep breath. I overheard something today," she said quietly. "About the cafe, about your company." Her voice shook. "Are you planning to buy it?" Daniel's face softened, and he reached out to place a reassuring hand near hers, careful not to startle her. "Emma, I can explain," he said. "I never wanted you to worry. I care about this cafe, about the people here. I'll make sure nothing happens to it. Everyone will keep their jobs. I'll handle it. I promise." Emma felt a flood of relief, but also an overwhelming sense of gratitude and disbelief. The man who had quietly watched her struggle, the man who had reached out in kindness before, was now ensuring that her sanctuary remained safe. For the first time, she understood the depth of his intentions, the sincerity behind his gestures. It wasn't just about money or influence. It was about people, about connection, and about doing the right thing. As the tension eased, Emma realized something profound. The bond they were building wasn't just about chance encounters or gestures of kindness. It was about trust, about seeing and being seen, and about the unexpected ways that people can enter our lives and change them forever. Emma had started to feel a fragile sense of peace. Over the past few weeks, her connection with Daniel had grown quietly, almost naturally. They met at the cafe with increasing frequency, sharing small moments that slowly built trust and understanding. Emma had begun to let herself hope, to imagine that maybe this stranger who had seen her in her most vulnerable state could become something more than a fleeting part of her life. She cherished the moments of laughter, the quiet conversations, and the gentle way Daniel seemed to notice the smallest things about her. But peace, she would soon realize, could be fleeting. One afternoon, as she was clearing tables, a co-worker approached her with a hesitant expression. "Emma, you should probably sit down for this," he said. He handed her a printed notice from a recent company meeting. Emma's hands shook as she unfolded it. Her eyes scanned the words quickly, and the color drained from her face. Her stomach clenched, and her heart raced. Daniel's company was planning to buy out the cafe. The small, warm place she had grown to love, the place where strangers could be kind, where laughter and conversation filled the air, was going to be replaced by a sleek, high-end chain. Her co-workers were tense, uncertain about their future, and she realized with horror that her safe space, the place that had been a refuge, could be taken away. Emma felt betrayed. The man who had left the note, who had watched her with curiosity and kindness, was tied to this plan. She struggled to reconcile the caring person she had come to trust with the powerful executive behind this corporate decision. Her hands trembled as she clutched the notice, her mind racing. She couldn't just confront him blindly, not without knowing the full story, but the tension inside her was unbearable. Later that day, when Daniel arrived at the cafe, Emma's emotions were raw. She had tried to compose herself, but her voice betrayed her as she spoke. "Daniel, I need to ask you something," she began, her tone sharp with fear and frustration. "I overheard something about your company, about this cafe. Are you planning to buy it?" Daniel froze for a moment, seeing the fear and anger in her eyes. He had known this day might come, but he hadn't expected the confrontation to feel so immediate and raw. He reached out carefully, trying to ease the tension without overstepping. "Emma, I can explain, he said, his voice calm but serious. I never wanted you to worry. I care about this place. I care about the people here. No one will lose their job. I promise. Emma pulled back slightly, still trembling. I don't understand. How can you care about the cafe and also be behind a plan that could destroy it? Her voice was a mix of hurt and disbelief. I trusted you, I thought. I thought you were different. Daniel's expression softened, and he sighed, looking down at the table as if searching for the right words. I didn't want to involve you until I was sure how I could handle it, he admitted. I wanted to protect you from stress you didn't deserve. But I should have been honest from the beginning. I never wanted to hurt you, or this cafe. Emma felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Relief mingled with lingering suspicion. Part of her wanted to believe him, to accept that the man who had quietly helped her was still on her side. But another part of her was wary, unsure if she could reconcile the kindness she had experienced with the immense power and influence he wielded. She took a deep breath, her hands tightening on the edge of the table. Daniel leaned closer, his tone earnest. Emma, I promise you this cafe will stay. I've made arrangements to ensure that nothing changes. Everyone here will keep their jobs. The space will remain exactly as it is. I just wanted to make sure I could protect it before telling you. Emma's eyes filled with tears, not just from relief, but from the overwhelming weight of the situation and the realization that Daniel's intentions were genuine. The man who had left the note, who had observed her struggles with quiet care, was not only trustworthy, but willing to use his power to protect what mattered to her. For a long moment, silence hung between them. Outside, the city moved on, oblivious to the intense conversation unfolding in the small corner of the cafe. Emma felt a sense of clarity amidst the chaos of emotions. She realized that trust was a fragile thing, and that vulnerability was not weakness. It was a doorway to connection. She had been brave in letting herself be seen, and Daniel had been brave in protecting her world without asking for recognition or reward. Finally she spoke, her voice trembling but steady. I believe you, she said softly. I can see that you're not just protecting the cafe, you're protecting people. That matters. Daniel nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. It does matter, he said. And it's not just about the cafe. It's about showing that kindness, honesty, and integrity can coexist with responsibility and power. You've reminded me of that, Emma. The tension between them began to ease, replaced by a new understanding. They both knew that the road ahead wouldn't be simple. Life was complicated, and their worlds were different. But they had discovered something rare: trust, honesty, and a genuine desire to protect what mattered most. Over the next few weeks, Daniel quietly ensured that the cafe remained safe. Employees continued to work without fear of layoffs, and the familiar warmth of the space stayed intact. Emma watched the changes unfold with cautious optimism, grateful for the way Daniel had handled the situation with integrity and care. Every time she saw him, she felt a deepening respect, a growing trust, and a subtle hope that their connection could survive the complexities of life. One afternoon, as she served customers, she noticed Daniel sitting quietly at a table, reviewing some documents. He looked up and smiled when their eyes met, a small but meaningful gesture. Emma realized that despite the challenges and fears, there was a bond forming between them, one built on mutual respect, trust, and the understanding that small acts of courage and kindness could ripple through their lives in unexpected ways. That evening, as the cafe began to close, Daniel approached her once more. Emma, he said gently, thank you for trusting me. I know it wasn't easy, but your trust means more than I can say. Emma smiled, feeling the warmth of the moment wash over her. I had to, she replied softly, because I saw who you are, and I know you care. That's what matters. Daniel nodded, and for the first time the tension and fear of the past week seemed to dissolve. They both understood that the journey ahead would have challenges, but they were willing to face them together, grounded in trust and the knowledge that genuine kindness could change lives. As Emma locked up the cafe that night, she reflected on the twists of fate that had led her to this moment. The $5 she had nervously counted in her wallet, the blind date that had gone wrong, the mysterious note from a stranger. Life had a way of surprising her, she realized, and sometimes those surprises were more profound than she could ever imagine. In the quiet of the empty cafe, she smiled to herself, knowing that she had witnessed something extraordinary, a man who had seen her, cared for her world, and chosen to act in ways that protected more than just property. He had acted to preserve humanity in small, quiet ways, and in doing so, had touched her life in ways she would never forget. Weeks had passed since the confrontation about the cafe, and life had settled into a delicate rhythm. The little cafe remained exactly as it had always been, warm, bustling, and familiar. Emma continued to work there, serving customers with the same gentle care. But now she carried a new sense of confidence and security. The knowledge that Daniel had quietly ensured the cafe's safety gave her a sense of peace she hadn't felt in months. Daniel had also been there more often. No longer just the quiet observer, he had become a familiar presence, sharing small laughs, meaningful glances, and conversations that felt effortless. He had a way of being present without overwhelming, of making someone feel seen while quietly respecting their space. Emma noticed how natural it felt to have him nearby, how the tension of her daily struggles seemed lighter in his presence. One crisp Saturday afternoon, the cafe was filled with the aroma of fresh pastries and the low hum of conversation. Emma was balancing a tray of drinks when she noticed Daniel sitting with his daughter, Lily. Emma's chest tightened slightly at the sight. This was new territory for her. She had grown close to Daniel, but meeting Lily was a different kind of step. Daniel caught her gaze and smiled warmly. "Emma," he said, motioning her over. "Come say hi." Emma approached cautiously, her nerves tingling with anticipation. Lily looked up from her coloring book, her eyes wide and curious. "Hi," she said brightly, her voice filled with the kind of unfiltered enthusiasm only children have. Emma smiled, kneeling slightly to meet her gaze. "Hi there. What are you drawing?" Lily proudly showed her a colorful picture of the cafe with little stick figures representing Emma, Daniel, and herself. "That's us," she exclaimed. "And that's you," pointing at Emma in the picture. Emma laughed softly, her heart warming. The small gesture spoke volumes. Lily had already accepted her presence in their lives without hesitation. As Emma took an order from another table, she couldn't stop stealing glances at Daniel and Lily. There was a gentle rhythm to their interactions, a natural flow that made everything seem simple and right. Daniel noticed her attention and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging the unspoken connection growing between them. Later, after the cafe had quieted down, Daniel and Emma found themselves sitting across from each other at their usual corner table. The air between them was filled with a comfortable silence, the kind that comes after weeks of shared understanding and small, meaningful conversations. "Emma," Daniel began softly, "I want you to know I didn't just leave that note the other day because I wanted to be kind. I left it because I noticed you, because I saw someone working hard, someone vulnerable yet strong, someone who deserved to be recognized." His voice was earnest, steady, and filled with an emotion that made Emma's chest ache. Emma looked down at her hands, fidgeting slightly with a napkin. I never expected anyone to notice me," she admitted quietly. "Not like that. Not in a way that mattered. That note, it changed how I saw everything. It made me feel safe in a way I didn't know I could feel." Daniel reached across the table, his hand brushing hers gently. "You deserve to feel safe," he said simply. "And not just here, not just in moments like this. You deserve to be seen, truly seen, and to be supported without conditions. That's how I want to be for you." Emma felt her eyes well up with tears, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming intensity of the moment. The fear, the uncertainty, the years of struggling to be noticed. They all seemed to converge in this small gesture of honesty and care. She realized that in Daniel, she had found someone who not only saw her, but also chose to act in ways that protected her world and her heart. Days later, the café hosted a small celebration to mark the preservation of the space and the continued stability for its employees. The regular customers were there, chatting and laughing, unaware of the quiet battles that had been fought behind the scenes. Emma moved through the room, serving drinks and smiling at familiar faces, her heart light. Daniel and Lily were sitting at a small table near the window, enjoying the celebration quietly. Emma approached them, carrying a tray of pastries. "Would you like some?" she asked, smiling at both of them. Lily eagerly took a small pastry, her eyes twinkling. "Thank you," she said. Daniel took one as well, and when their eyes met, there was a shared understanding, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had brought them to this moment. As the celebration continued, Emma found herself reflecting on how far she had come. The $5 she had nervously counted in her wallet on the day of the blind date. The awkward and disappointing date, the mysterious note that had shifted her day. The growing trust with Daniel, and finally, the confrontation about the café. All these moments had led to this, a sense of security, connection, and a budding hope for the future. As the café emptied and the day drew to a close, Daniel handed Emma a small envelope. "For you," he said quietly, his eyes holding hers. Emma opened it carefully. Inside was a simple note. "Sometimes the best things in life cost nothing at all." She laughed softly, a sound filled with relief and joy. The journey that had begun with anxiety and a mere $5 had transformed into something unexpected and extraordinary. She realized that life had a way of presenting challenges and surprises, but it also had a way of offering grace, kindness, and unexpected connections. Daniel stood and offered his hand to help her with her coat. "Ready to go?" he asked. Emma took his hand, feeling the warmth and steadiness of his grip. "I am," she replied, her heart full. As they stepped out into the crisp evening air, Emma looked up at the city lights and felt a deep sense of gratitude. The struggles she had faced, the moments of vulnerability, the small acts of kindness, they had all led her here. And she knew with a quiet certainty that this was only the beginning. For the first time in a long while, she felt truly seen, truly supported, and truly hopeful. And as Daniel and Lily walked beside her, she realized that the best stories often start in the most unexpected ways, with a single act of kindness, a quiet gesture, and a willingness to notice someone when no one else does. The $5 she had nervously carried in her wallet seemed almost symbolic now. It had been the small spark that ignited a chain of events, leading to friendship, trust, and perhaps even love. Emma smiled, feeling rich in ways she had never imagined. Life had shown her that sometimes the simplest gestures could change everything, and that sometimes people who notice and care could transform ordinary moments into extraordinary memories. And as the city lights glimmered around them, Emma knew that her story, once defined by struggle and uncertainty, was now filled with hope, connection, and the promise of a future she hadn't dared to imagine before. Emma's $5 struggle turned into a life-changing connection, proving that a single act of kindness can change everything. What would you do if you were in her shoes? Could a stranger really change your life? Comment below and tell us your story. And if you loved this journey from struggle to hope, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the next incredible story just like this one.